This is the Mountain and Prairie Podcast. I'm Ed Robertson. This is a special episode recorded live in Bozeman at the premiere of an important new short film titled Good Fire, Bad Fire, Inside the Race to Restore America's Forests. On the evening of May 16, 2024, around 200 folks gathered at Bozeman's Museum of the Rockies to watch the 15-minute film, which captures the breathtaking beauty of our nation's forests and delves into the urgent crisis threatening their existence. Following the screening, I moderated a panel discussion featuring an extremely impressive lineup of some of the nation's leading conservationists and forest health experts. The onstage conversation gave us the opportunity to dig deeper into some of the issues raised by the film and glean valuable insights into the importance of responsible forest management from ecological, recreational, economic, and policy perspectives. Good Fire, Bad Fire was directed by filmmaker Eric Ian and produced by the team at the Property and Environment Research Center, better known as PERC, and PERC also hosted the event. The panelists you'll hear in this episode are Brian Ferebee, who's the Chief Executive of Intergovernmental Relations for the U.S. Forest Service, Randy Newberg, who's a renowned conservationist and the host of Fresh Tracks with Randy Newberg and Hunt Talk Radio, Morgan Varner, who's the Director of Fire Research at Tall Timbers, Corey Llewellyn, who's the District Ranger for the Bozeman Ranger District, Hannah Downey, who's the Policy Director at PERC, and Brian Yablonsky, who's the CEO of PERC and a past Mountain and Prairie podcast guest. I could have spoken with each of these experts individually for several hours each, but having them all share a stage and combine their wide range of expertise into a single conversation was a powerfully educational experience. While you could listen to this episode on its own, I would strongly encourage you to first spend 15 minutes watching Good Fire, Bad Fire as a primer for this episode. There's a link in the episode notes, and it's embedded on the episode webpage. I'd also encourage you to check out the episode notes for a full list of all the topics we discussed, which included everything from a history of fire as a resource management tool to the Forest Service's evolving approach to wildfires and forest health. We talked about forest health's impact on hunting and fishing, the pros and cons of policies such as the ESA and NEPA, on-the-ground success stories, optimistic good news about the future of forest health, and much more. There were tons of resources mentioned as well, all of which are listed and linked on this episode's webpage. A huge thanks to Brian Yablonsky and the team at PERC for creating such an important film and for inviting me to participate in such an enlightening conversation. I hope you enjoy the film as much as I did, and I hope that this discussion provides some new insights into the all-important issue of forest health in the American West. Again, Eric, where are you? That was an awesome film. Eric told me before, and this is not a joke, his career prior to filmmaking was he was a hacker. No joke, on the computer, and now he's devoted his skills to filmmaking. He's obviously, I think it's going to work out for you, Eric. Good job. My name's Ed Robertson. I was so nicely invited to come tonight to moderate and ask questions. I started a podcast about 8 years ago called Mountain and Prairie, just kind of as a side project. I was in the real estate business and looking for kind of a more of a creative outlet, and started this podcast, and nobody really listened for probably 3 or 4 years, and then finally people did start listening. And the podcast is really about interesting people doing important work in the American West, which all of these people obviously qualify for that. And I was thinking, I'm obviously not from the West with this accent. I'm from Eastern North Carolina originally, but my love affair with the West started really right in this area, kind of between Jackson Hole and, through Bozeman and up to Missoula when I was working up here. And I had this accent, and I would work a lot with ranchers, and I would show up and start talking to ranchers. And on 2 separate occasions, completely unrelated, I opened my mouth and started talking, and they said, "Are you from Scotland?" So I promise I'm not from Scotland. But anyway, as I mentioned, all these folks are so amazing in what they do, both what they do, but also why and how they do it. two notes. If you listen to the podcast, you know that I could talk to each one of these folks for 3 or 4 hours apiece, and we wouldn't run out of stuff to talk about. We've only got about 45 minutes. So I'm going to keep my questions brief. We are not going to have a Q&A, but thankfully we've got a reception after the fact, so you can have one-on-one Q&A. And then second or third, if you have a friend that is not here tonight, we're recording this for the podcast, and we'll be putting it out with links to the film in a few weeks. So first thing I would love for everybody, we got intros earlier, but just to put faces with names, if you could just quickly introduce yourself, and we'll go down the line.
Brian Ferebee, happy to be with you and leading our wildfire crisis strategy work for the agency.
Brian Yablonsky, CEO of the Property Environment Research Center.
Randy Newberg, produced media platforms related to hunting and conservation and lived in Bozeman for 33 years.
I'm Hannah Downey. I'm the Policy Director at PERC.
Morgan Varner, I'm the Director of Research at Tall Timbers, based in Tallahassee, Florida.
Yeah, good evening. I'm Corey Llewellyn. I'm the District Ranger here on the Bozeman Ranger District.
Great, thanks. Brian Ferebee, I'd love to start with you. And Brian and I found out we grew up about 80 miles from each other in eastern North Carolina, but you don't have a cool accent like me. But I'd love to hear more about where the Forest Service stands right now with their approach to wildfire and forest health, because it seems from my outsider's knowledge that we've had 100 years of suppression, and now we're kind of in this transition where people are starting to understand, thanks to all the science, just how important it is to manage these forests more actively. And so when you think about your role from a high level, how would you describe where the Forest Service is right now?
Thanks for the question. And how I would describe it is, the Forest Service has always been into managing wildfires and wildfire suppression, as the film articulates. I think what we've seen in the last couple decades with the severity and the intensity of wildfires, and not just on natural resources, but actually on critical infrastructure and communities, has put us in a position to acknowledge we just fundamentally needed to approach our work differently. And it's not about suppression as much as it is about active management. Mm-hmm. And so about just a little under 3 years ago, we put out what we called our wildfire crisis strategy, which was just an acknowledgement that we needed to change the pace and the scale of the work that we were doing. And we needed to bring a much more focus to it, because when you think about some of the elements that have put us in this place, suppression, a growing infrastructure in our wildland-urban interface, drought, climate, fuel buildup. We just felt like what we call the random acts of conservation we couldn't do anymore. We were, what we were seeing is even with our best of efforts, the way we were approaching it, they were being overtaken by wildfires. Mm-hmm. And we were starting to see more and more fire actually burning into communities, which when I started out in the Forest Service multiple decades ago, that was a phenomenon we just did not experience. But now it is nothing to see thousands of acres burn in a burning period, communities being impacted, watersheds being impacted. So, we made a decision that we were going to change how we look at wildfire. We were going to get more actively in management, and we were going to do it at a scale commensurate with the risk we were trying to respond to.
Thank you. Randy, I'd love to jump over to you as a resident here in the Bozeman area for over 3 decades, as committed of a public lands advocate as anybody can find, and a really hardcore hunter on top of all that. How do you think about forest management, and how does that impact both your work in the conservation space and advocating for public lands, but then also just your fall hunts when you go out? How does the forest and the current state of forest affect what you do?
Yeah, I think the film made mention that a lot of people look at this and say, oh, this is beautiful. Well, if you're an elk, it's not beautiful. It's a good place to starve to death. Elk are grazers. They need forage. And fire suppression, as the canopy grows, ends up just suppressing the forage. As we suppress fire, we suppress forage. That's not good for elk. And because I eat a lot of elk, I worry about it. But there's a lot of other things that eat elk around here. Wolves and grizzly bears and coyotes and, all the birds. So this entire system that we live around in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem is lacking some really critical components. And the nutrient transmission, if you want to call it that happens in Yellowstone happens because of elk. And if we don't have elk on this landscape, because the landscape's not managed in a healthy manner, even if I'm not the one eating the elk, if you care about wildlife and you care about this ecosystem, you should really care about proper forest management.
Thank you. Morgan, I'd love to jump over to you next. As I was preparing for this and had some great conversations in the lead up, I learned a whole chapter of history in America that I didn't know anything about. And it's embarrassing, but that's kind of the theme of the podcast. Every time I talk to an expert, I didn't know anything about that. But I would love for you to give us kind of a brief history lesson of how fire in the United States came to be used as a tool for forest management, because I found it fascinating. And it was right in my backyard where I grew up.
Yeah. Well, as Brian mentioned, the film did a great job doing, the indigenous peoples clearly were using fire everywhere and a lot of the time. A lot of our fire history record shows landscapes that had really frequent fire, and the climate doesn't predict that. It means that people were driving that landscape, and the evidence for all these benefits that we receive are pretty obvious. And we all know the Smoky story. It is, as it was portrayed, it's a complicated story. And in the American South, during that period, as you mentioned, the 1920s, there were a group of people who were bucking the trend and who were burning when society, and even more so, there was like in many places in the West, there was an all-out effort to stamp out fire and to stamp out human burning. In that period, there was a real fight between what people would call Indian burning, Paiute burning, light burning versus full suppression. And we know who won that battle. We all live that experience now. But there was this group of people who were still burning, and they were burning not for elk in the Southeast, although they used to be there. They were burning for a small bird that was a game bird, the bobwhite quail. And they found pretty quickly that where they burned, bobwhite quail did very well, and where fire was absent, bobwhite quail went into a steep decline. And so the study of that and the evidence provided by it slowly fought this battle against Smoky. In the communities, and this may be surprising, I hope it's surprising because it's so extreme, the Forest Service in the individual states, a lot of the blame is put on the Forest Service for America's wildfire crisis, but the individual states played a pretty great role in it too. And they would have these small film shows in small communities. They call it the Southern Forestry Education Project, or the Dixie Crusaders. Wow. And they were truly on a crusade, and they talked about the evils of light burning. And so, that 100 years later seems completely ridiculous on lots of levels, but that's certainly what the landscape and those who fought against that confronted ideas, feelings, and some experiences with data. And the data continue to show, whether it's elk in the northern Rockies or bobwhite quail in the southeastern coastal plain, fire clearly benefited them and a lot of other species.
Thanks for that. I wish I'd had a professor like you when I was in college. I was so busy drawing pictures and not paying attention. Corey, I should have gotten an art degree because I just drew pictures all the time. Corey, in the film, first of all, great job in the film. Second of all, that one scene where we're talking about the timeline and it shows the length of the whole project, and then some of the road bumps or speed bumps that popped up along the way. I was wondering if you could expand a bit on some of the details of exactly what kind of, whether it's litigation or whether it was more required research, but just give an example or give some color around exactly what happened that slowed it down. Because it was all very clear that it got slowed down, but I'd love to hear more details about that if you don't mind.
Yeah, there are a few things that come to mind, and it's easy to talk about a lot of them under the umbrella of just how much time it took. And I don't think the first thing that comes to mind, and this is not I don't consider this an issue or a challenge, but want to acknowledge the complexity of the landscape. I mean, it's just an incredible, complex landscape. It's grizzly bear habitat, it's lynx habitat. It is one of, if not the heaviest recreated watersheds in the state of Montana. And it's for good reason. I mean, it's beautiful, and I'm sure most of you have been up there, and it's wonderful. And so we wanted to have really high level community engagement. We knew our community cares about this landscape. Most folks live here because of this landscape. So we had a pretty, what I would consider robust public engagement, lots of open houses, and that took a little bit longer compared to maybe to some other projects that are not maybe as complex. Mm-hmm. So, but that was on purpose. I mean, we wanted to take the time to get community engagement. And then, the tools we had at the time, we did an EIS, which is one of our, that's our more lengthier type of an analysis, developing alternatives with a variety of different public comment and review periods, things of that nature. But then, as you saw in the film, we made a decision in 2011, and of course we were litigated, and that's not new to us. I mean, that's part of doing management here in National Forest in Montana. And then we had the injunction there, final injunction, if you will, in 2013. And yeah, the litigation took a while to address the comments brought up from the judge. And that was a little different. It's a little unique for this project because a lot of times when we get some litigation on a project, sometimes the concerns that need to be addressed are very project specific. They're specifically related to that specific decision on that, for this case, BMW. Yeah. But it related for this one, it was tied to critical habitat with lynx. And it wasn't just how we were doing it on the Custer-Gallatin National Forest. It was how we were addressing consultation at a broader level, at the regional level, at the agency level. And so it took a lot longer. There's more layers to it, if you will. And so it took longer just to get through some of the litigation pieces on that. And I think some challenges, from the relationship component, we're really grateful for the city of Bozeman. I mean, they've been an amazing partner for us. And, we wanted to implement, we are currently implementing this project concurrently together to try to minimize impacts to the landscape, minimize short-term impacts to our community instead of 10 years of trail closure or try to get the work done in 3 years. And the city, they're implementing fields work on their land while we're also implementing, fields work on National Forest. And the city waited for us, and there's some trade-offs with that. Fortunately enough, we never had yet that large fire. But the longer we waited, we were kind of, time wasn't on our side, if you will, because at some point we will have a large fire on that landscape. And we have had fires in the landscape in the watershed, and we were successful with able to suppressing them. So that was, the city patiently waiting for us to be able to move forward together is something that I think is important to recognize.
Yeah. I think the time factor is just so clear of how long this is taking. And then when you lay out how much forest there is that needs to be managed in this way, the math just doesn't line up. And so, Hannah, that brings me to you. In addition to being a pretty awesome mountain biker, Hannah is in D.C. getting deep into all these issues and testifying in front of Congress. So any question I have is nothing for Hannah. But I would love to hear, when you hear Corey explaining those long timelines and all these roadblocks that pop up or speed bumps, could you just give us a kind of a lesson on or could you talk about perhaps the Endangered Species Act, perhaps NEPA, and how we could possibly, in your mind, streamline those things a little bit?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think Corey did a really nice job of laying out just how complex the process is to actually get a project needed for forest restoration to the point where we're actually doing the work, that needed work on the ground. And you laid out so nicely the complexities of lynx habitat, grizzly bear habitat, recreation, our watershed, all of these things that make forest restoration such a true conservation issue. It warrants some consideration of these well-intentioned laws that are meant to give us pause to consider how do our actions impact the environment. But as I think has been really well laid out, we're at a point in time where we have to ask, compared to what? If a fire rips through and just destroys all of that, it might be nice to stop and think about grizzly habitat and lynx habitat and recreation impacts, but we also have to weigh the costs of what happens if we do nothing. So that's a way that I'd be encouraged to see things change. And I think we're at such a unique opportunity in this space where there's realization of those impacts. It's no longer just, do we put out fires? Do we let fires burn? Are there logging interests or not? This is a real conservation problem. And there's so much enthusiasm and I think genuine interest from the science, from the conservationists, from the policymakers, this wide range of groups, that now I think is the time where we can take that and turn it into action to try and say, how do we start weighing that compared to what is the risk, and try and expedite some of those processes.
And Brian, to you now, PERC, I think everybody here is familiar with PERC's mission, and it's conservation and it's free markets. And so what is PERC's role in this? How do you see, why of all the different projects that PERC could devote its attention and its resources and all the smart people that are focused on these problems, why this?
Yeah, great question. Thanks for that. It's interesting. PERC was founded by a handful of outdoor-loving economists, and economists like to say incentives matter, and we believe incentives matter for conservation too. It's no different than anything else an economist might think about. And how can you better align incentives to improve our public lands is something that PERC's looked at for a long time. We've been working on deferred maintenance issues in the national parks and trying to help address that. And conservation, we believe, at its core, is about taking care of the thing that you own. And the American people own our forest lands. We should put a priority on taking care of that and trying to find the incentives that get that right. And so I think about this issue, and we have the science that tells us something. We have historic funding for this effort. We have the management knowledge of what needs to be done. And then so that begs the question, like, what's slowing this down? Mm-hmm. What's holding this back? And that's where PERC really comes in to look at those institutional challenges that might be creating headwinds here. One of the federal land managers of one of our units said recently, wildfire is fast, bureaucracy is slow. And it was said out of frustration. And conservation, historically, if you go back decades, conservation used to be about slowing down. Yep. It really was. The laws were put in place and they were needed to slow down. But in this next era of conservation, with some of these new challenges that we didn't anticipate at the time the Endangered Species Act was passed or NEPA was passed, means that conservation now needs to be about speeding things up. Yep. And especially when it comes to restoration, that could be Everglades restoration in Florida, or wetlands restoration in Louisiana, or forest restoration out west. We need to move with with some speed here. And the challenge is we have this crisis. I mean, this is true. I think we all agree this is like, we're in a crisis situation. It's an emergency. And yet we're using normal business as usual procedures as if this isn't a crisis. If that was the case, like, America would never win a war, would never find a vaccine for COVID. I mean, when you're in that kind of scenario, you need to accelerate. And I think my favorite line in the movie comes from Brian, who says we need to manage differently and we need to manage with a sense of urgency. Mm-hmm.
So, Brian Ferebee, when you've got all this science and you've got all this experience, you've got this great team of people that have this vision of where it needs to be. And for those of us not deep in the world of Washington, D.C., like, what is preventing you and your team from, like, if you could snap your fingers and next week you're going to be doing exactly what you feel like you need to be doing, what is preventing that? Is it something about Congress? Is it something about funding? What is the roadblock to getting us to this next level of forest management?
So some of this really is about, one, you work in the government, which is a system.
Sure.
Right? And it wasn't designed to work fast, whether we like it or not. And I'd say fundamentally just some cultural norms. You learn over the years these things and you continue to perpetuate those. And so for us, as much as it is at the end of the day about implementation of work on the ground in terms of vegetation management, there's a lot of parts to this system. Everything from how long it actually does. The agency absolutely wants to redeem its responsibility when it comes to environmental compliance, but not in a 10-year time frame or 17-year time frame. That's just not going to help any of us given what we see is at stake and at risk. And so when I think about, we received a tremendous amount of funding in the agency to show up differently, and we still have to comply with everything we did before we received the funding, which would mean you might move a little faster, but maybe not as fast as you would like. There are still a number of our publics that are on a vast spectrum of this work, and you have to spend time in a very collaborative frame, which takes time, and it's important to take that time. We have communities that are all in and they get it and they're ready to roll, and we have some other communities or members of communities that are a little bit speculative, and they have different perspectives and views, and you just have to take and listen to that and help that form your approach. And so all of these items or activities take time. Mm-hmm. And I'll tell you, as important as all of them are, it doesn't negate the fact that you feel like you don't have a lot of time on the clock. We don't have fire season anymore. We have wildfires somewhere all year long. And for me, I look at a lot of landscapes as I travel, and it's just a matter of time. Mm-hmm. It is a matter of time. And so whether we do it, in conditions like Corey mentioned that we want, or it happens in a different frame, you get very different outcomes. And so, so it's timing-wise, it is the environmental compliance aspect of things that is very much necessary, but it would be nice to be able to do it in a different time frame. Mm-hmm. Collaboration, bringing our publics along and building that social acceptance, doing it in a faster time frame. And so it's forums like this, it's projects like this that I think really help us as members of the community that understand and help share that perspective and word that does help us expedite things. I just left a county commissioner that was all in and, carrying the word, so to speak, mm-hmm. to a lot of folks. And so I think it's the collective us that's going to help the Forest Service overcome some of these barriers, if you will, or some of these impediments to speed. Maybe I would say it that way. But you just have to think about a lot of resources into a system, but the system is still the same. You have to do all the same things. And so it's very difficult to expedite in a system that's designed to make you check a lot of boxes.
Randy, I'd love to go back to you for a minute. I feel like the last maybe 10 years or so, it's become very clear what a force outdoorsmen, outdoors people, hunters, anglers, public land users are politically. And I feel like there's just been such an amazing kind of organization of those voices. And so when you hear, and you're obviously concerned about this issue, you wouldn't be here otherwise, what would you recommend to hunters and anglers who look to you for guidance on advocacy? How would you recommend that they take action on this? Because you strike me as somebody who prefers action and you don't sit around much.
Well, I'm not bound by the confines of institutional inertia, as I call it. So I can be a little rougher on the edges about some of this stuff. And I tell all of my audience that it does no good to get on Facebook and complain about it. You need to get involved. You need to get engaged. You need to go out there and experience it and learn for yourself so you're not subject to disinformation or misinformation, because in today's world, there are an awful lot of people who have their own incentives for why they want misinformation or disinformation. You need to talk to your elected people. Because one of the problems of the whole litigation industry, again, I'm not bound by confines, so I'm going to call it that, is that who do we blame when we don't think something's happening? Damn feds, right? Well, here's Corey. They're trying to do, Brian, you guys are trying to do the right thing and you're getting litigated. you get the blame for the litigation. You're the one trying to solve the problem, but you get litigated and you get blamed for it. So part of this is an education where I think those of us who are citizens and who are concerned, we have to understand how this process works and why it works. And there's some other things to it that if you go out there and you experience and you hike it and you fish it and you hunt it or just observe it, you're going to see a lot of things that are going to open your eyes. And one of our biggest fires we ever had around here was in 2006. It started up in Crow Mountain, Meat Rack, and it came through the AB Wilderness area, came up the West Boulder, hopped the main boulder, and went all the way over to the Stillwater. That was one of my favorite places to hunt elk. There aren't many elk there now. And you'd think like, wow, I thought burns were great for elk. Not burns that large, not burns at that intensity, not burns that become populated with invasive plant species, which becomes a whole nother issue related to burns, is how do we manage these lands after a burn comes? Because elk need native forage, native grasses. But if you talk to people, and I hadn't been there and experienced it myself, I could have easily been swayed to think, oh, this was great for elk. Well, if you go there now, it's a thistle patch. It's a wilderness area. It's one of our greatest wilderness areas, and it's a thistle patch with hardly any elk in it. Why? Because these people aren't given the resources, they aren't given the priority to implement what they know has to be done. And we're the people who can help with that. We're the ones who have to call our senator, call our congressperson, call our governor, and meet with our county commissioners, because that's where this process starts to change. And that's what I tell my audience.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Thank you. Morgan, I want to go back to you for a minute. You're in the Southeast, where it's flat and humid, but you've been able to, yeah, it feels good out here, doesn't it? When I go home, I can't deal with it anymore. When I was in the conservation business, I found that when you find a project that is good for a specific area, that is really great because it serves that specific area. But where the real power comes is when those lessons learned from operating that specific area can be applied to other regions. And I feel like that's kind of what y'all are doing. You're on the far other side of the country, completely different ecosystem, but you've established these lessons that we can apply out here, dry, arid, rugged, public land versus private. Can you talk a bit about how you think about the lessons that have been learned in the Southeast and how they can best be applied out this way?
Yeah, it's a great question. When we have a lot of congressional visitors, scientists from around the world visiting our little small place in North Florida to see the evidence of decades of research and also a lot of land stewardship. And one of the, I'll call it a throwaway comment, is, well, it's really easy here. And then it makes all of us bristle because the place where we're burning, so Tallahassee is, as you may know, the state capital. It has an international airport, and when I say international airport, I mean like a Bozeman International Airport, an interstate, major tourism industry, major sporting events that take place throughout the year with two major universities. And we're burning there when legislature is in session. That's our peak burning period. Yeah. And all those things stack up to the easy things that we say, the reasons why you can't burn. The communities don't like it. I live in I'll call it posh, the most posh part of Tallahassee. And if I'm out mowing the grass or something and it's smoky, my neighbors will all go, hey, prescribed fire, right? They know it protects them. They know that it provides, and more importantly than protecting them, and I think this is the lesson from the Southeast, is it provides all the environmental benefits. The reason that they live there is to be in that beautiful place. Mm-hmm. They're there to run and mountain bike in places that have incredible biodiversity, that have endangered species that are really common, to receive the benefits that, we didn't invent, humans using fire. It was not a European, a settler invention. Yeah. These were the ways that these landscapes could be stewarded that provide resilience when climate is fluctuating, that provide resilience during all the challenges. And I think the lesson, there are a lot of lessons from that. One is you can do it. Another is focusing on the benefits, focusing on biodiversity. It's hard to find anyone who hates wildflowers and hates beautiful birds that fly. And the other part of that is the last part that makes the Tallahassee and a lot of the Southern experience relevant and challenging is that private landowners are involved. Yeah. People are involved, and it makes it's easy to say the Forest Service or the Park Service or the state agency, wherever you are, but having private landowners involved, your neighbor, the guy you see in the grocery store, or the person you pick up when you're picking up your children from daycare. Mm-hmm. It's those people burning. And that part, I think, is really inspiring, and it makes it where we all are part of a solution, and we're all part of stewarding lands that we all love.
I love that.
I'm pretty sure that when Corey goes outside, he may not get the thumbs up. He might get another digit, and it's not we're number one. We probably need to change that.
Yeah. Well, speaking of that, Corey, I would love to hear. We want some horror stories. No, I'm just joking. So this approach that was shown so great in the film of using mechanized equipment, chainsaws to thin, followed by burning. Could you give us some examples, either that you've worked on or that you know of through the Forest Service, but some kind of success stories of these type of things that on the ground, you were the point of the spear. You're on the ground doing this work. I'd love to hear from you about some things that you consider success stories in this world.
Yeah, there's a couple things that come to mind. And I'll speak kind of broadly at first just in regard to how we respond from a suppression perspective on these large-scale fires. And, as a firefighter myself or as an agency administrator now, it's very common what we call an indirect tactic where, we've got these large fires. They're not safe for us to engage. And so we're getting ahead of those fires. It might be a mile ahead. It might be several miles ahead. And we're doing real-time work that we're talking about right here. Our fire crews are building a fire line, then they're building some type of fuel break. It might be a shaded fuel break. It might be a 100-foot fuel, whatever it may be. And then when the time is right, they're using prescribed fire to treat that fuel break they just built. And ideal, by the time the wildfire gets to it, well, then there's not a whole lot left to burn. And then that treatment we've seen, I've seen it as a firefighter, I've seen it as an agency administrator, I've seen that be quite effective. So that's kind of more in a broader general perspective. When it comes to some specific projects, there's actually a project that I'm going to steal from Brian's stomping grounds there in Colorado. I used to work on the White River, and similar to the stuff we're talking right here, the Colorado, thousands of acres of dead lodgepole pine with 80 to 100% mortality rates from mountain pine beetle. And we needed to move quickly. We needed to start working and getting field work done to protect critical infrastructure, WUI. So actually in partnership with Denver Water, another municipal, I think we all know who Denver Water is, we started doing a lot of these type of treatments. And we were being very strategic, putting fuel breaks next to communities, next to critical infrastructure. And there's a project just outside of Silverthorne where there was a 500-foot fuel break that was implemented in 2011 while I was there. And Brian can correct me if I got anything wrong here. And then actually, and it was interesting because there was always you don't know if and when there's going to be a fire. And we'd always argue no, we're going to have fire. Fire's on this landscape. It's a matter of time. And then in 2018, which is after I left, sure enough, that fire came. We had a fast-moving, wind-driven fire that started in designated wilderness, and it was moving very quickly, wind-driven, directly towards hundreds of homes. And that fuel break is where all the firefighters engaged. That's area resources, retardant planes and helicopters, and we use the term a lot. They painted the fuel break with not real paint, but with retardant, and the ground crews were able to safely engage. That's where they could actually engage instead of they had a place to get in and get involved. And in that example, it worked. That fuel break was effective. It kept that fire checked in the wilderness and prevented the fire from coming out in the wilderness into the community, into subdivisions, into homes. And there was a lot of homes. It wasn't like one or two homes. There were a lot of homes. And it kept that fire in check, and it actually burnt back into the wilderness. And the agency and partners in the state and the county, they continued to take suppression tactics, and they put that fire out. But that fuel break worked. It was effective. And it's important to comment. I mean, it always does come down to the conditions. You know, sometimes we have that 1%. Bridger Foothills, we can come back to that later. But sometimes we're going to have really tough days where treatments may or may not be effective. But we don't always have those days. In fact, the Bridger Foothills was kind of one of those 1% days. Sure. And we need to be doing what we can to give our firefighters defensible space. And again, that Buffalo fire, you can Google it. It's on the internet. It is a really effective example that worked. And those are the things we're trying to do.
Thanks. And Hannah, or people that listen to the podcast know that I try to focus on the positive, but I think it's important also to look at the other side. And Hannah, when we were talking the other day, you told me a story about a specific fire that was the thinning process and the forest health process was marred up with litigation, and we kind of saw what can happen. Would you mind telling that story again?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really kind of prominent example that gets back to what I was talking about earlier of there's risks of not doing anything at this point in time. And this is the antelope fire on the Klamath National Forest. There was a project proposed looking a lot at this risk reduction, general forest health, these ecosystem benefits. And there were some concerns over how the project would impact spotted owl habitat. And so some of the litigious groups started to challenge and get involved and kind of hold up this review process so that work couldn't take place on the ground. While all of this was happening, sure enough, the fire burned through and destroyed all that spotted owl habitat that those groups were claiming to want to protect. And I think it's just such a powerful example of, as we look at these potential environmental benefits, the community benefits, all of these things, we have to continue to ask ourselves, what's at risk if we don't take action?
Mm-hmm. And then this is, Hannah, for you and Brian as well. I'd love to hear y'all's thoughts. You both spend a ton of time in Washington, D.C. You're both a lot of face time with elected officials and their teams. When you go in the door of a senator or anybody on Capitol Hill and start talking conservation, how is that met?
Great question. I would say it's met really positively, genuinely. I mean, I oftentimes say you go on any member of Congress's or policymaker, you go on their website and you read through their little bio and you have education and background and committees they're on and everything. But usually at the end, there's a sentence or two about what do they like to do in their free time. And the vast majority of time, it includes something outdoors or where they recognize these benefits. If they like to hike or take their dogs out or go take their kids swimming or whatever it might be. So there is kind of this genuine passion for it, and it's something that binds us all together. One thing I thought was really telling was last year when Washington, D.C. got worse smoke than Bozeman did, and we all kind of were like, okay, great, now you guys get to see it firsthand a little bit, but it was so telling. Every congressional office, Twitter and whatever, so everyone had their picture of the Washington Monument where you could barely see it through the smoke. And I'll tell you, we got a lot of calls after that. Mm-hmm. A lot of people saying, okay, we've heard about this. Maybe I'm from New Jersey or the Southeast or something, but all right, you guys have been talking about it. Tell us what to do. And that is really, it's really encouraging. It's really terrible that it's drawn out of so many people being impacted by the negatives and harms that can come from this, but it is fostering really good discussions. And I'm actually optimistic we can get some good work done.
Speaking of optimistic, thinking about the next 5 years, and this can be for anybody, when you think about the next 5 years, and where this is all going, and it seems like it's going in the right direction, although maybe not as fast as everybody would like. Not what do you want, but what if you had to predict what the next 5 years is going to look like for expanding and increasing the pace of forest health work throughout the West? What's your prediction? What's the crystal ball? And that could be anybody.
Well, I'm going to base this off of last year. So last year was really a record year in the history of the Forest Service. Last year, we prescribed burned almost 2 million acres, which vastly exceeds what we've ever been able to do in the past. And that's because of the importance of fire and ecologically and its benefits to reducing fuels. Last year, we actually treated both mechanically as well as prescribed burning, more than we ever had at a little more than 4 million acres. And so I think we're on the right trajectory. I think we're in the right places. I think there's still some work to even get beyond that scale, truthfully. And I would honestly tell you, we are still going to see watersheds that are important to people for drinking water and agricultural use impacted and lost. Mm-hmm. We're going to see communities impacted and lost as a result of wildfires. When you look at the amount of infrastructure in the wildland-urban interface and the pace of which we need to operate, even with those successes in the history of the Forest Service, they're still not at the scale. And I think, unfortunately, while we're going to have some successes over time, we're going to see some drastic impacts to our wildlife, to natural resources, and to communities.
I'm heartened. I'm getting older, and I know how things used to be, and I'm pretty heartened with the maturity of the conversation right now, up here, but also more broadly, that there has been for a long time. If you talk about fire, I fly all the time, and the person next to me is going to strike up a conversation, whether I have earbuds in or not, and I'm going to have to say it. I work on fire, and what it used to be was, oh my gosh, my cousin, knows about a wildfire, or there's something like that. But now when I try to get over saying that and say I work on prescribed fire, and hold my eyes up waiting for them to say something. And that conversation there or at the grocery store, wherever I'm visiting, is much more mature. They understand what prescribed fire is. They understand the need, and they understand that we can't do it overnight. Mm-hmm. And I like that conversation because it's a broader conservation conversation, mm-hmm. which is what we all really want in the end. I want to reduce severe wildfires, but what I really want is landscapes that have, great elk populations when I'm hiking with my kids, and having a conversation like that is showing that we're on the right path. Yeah. And I wouldn't have said this 20 years ago. I was super pessimistic about what our future looked like, and we've all experienced it over 20 years. Mm-hmm. But I'm much more optimistic for the future.
That's great. I told you this time was going to go by so fast, and here we are bumping up against time. But Brian, I'd like to wrap it up with you. A few weeks ago, I had this great podcast conversation with Christine Tompkins, who's done a bunch of conservation work down in South America, basically created 15 million acres of national parks down there. And she's very no nonsense. And during the conversation, she said, "I'm so glad you didn't ask me what gives me hope. Because I don't think you can just have hope. I think you have to earn hope. You have to work very, very hard to have hope. Hope comes as a result of working hard." And I feel like everybody on the stage is a perfect example of people that are all in, fully focused on action. And so I think you have the right to say what gives you hope. And I'd love to hear just kind of your good news on this subject, your optimistic take, you seem to be an optimist by nature. And I'd just love to hear kind of optimistic look at where we're going, assuming you have one.
No, I do. And one thing that gives me optimism is, us working with the agency here and, trying to help them. They're not out on an island. There are folks who are trying to help them do their jobs and get their work done. There's a story that gives me hope. I started my remarks talking one of the facts that to me is most stark has been the loss of the giant sequoia trees out west in just recent times, and the impact that crown fires are having on the giant sequoias. There was a fire in 2022 called the Washburn Fire in Yosemite National Park. It's amazing. And for those who don't know, there is a grove of sequoia trees there called the Mariposa Grove. This is not just some ordinary grove of sequoia trees. It's 500 old growth mature sequoia trees that are about 2,000 years old each. There are even some, like the grizzly giant, that are 3,000 years old. And so this grove is historic for that reason, but it's also historic in the sense that it was at the center of the idea of our national parks. The grove was designated as the world's first natural area protected in perpetuity by Abraham Lincoln in 1864. And that was the start of the national parks. So I go back to this wildfire is in Yosemite, and the way the winds are shifting, the fire is moving towards the Mariposa Grove. Now, the cool thing is, for a number of reasons, the Mariposa Grove for the last 50 years had actually been treated with prescribed fire and with mechanical thinning to take out some of the understory there. And this was a typical ferocious crown fire that was moving towards the grove, and everybody in Yosemite was holding their breath, and that fire hit the grove, and the fire intensity dropped dramatically right away, and it enabled the crews to actually steer the fire around the Mariposa Grove, and then the fire moved west and came out and kind of came back with its intensity. But having that, what happened as a result of prescribed fire and allowing the agencies to manage the way they now know that they need to manage is we just didn't save old growth sequoias. We saved the Declaration of Independence for conservation. Yeah. I mean, this was the origins of conservation in America. So that gives me hope that we have the examples of where these happen, as Corey gave a great example. The other thing I'll say is, in the South, a lesson we can learn, and Morgan knows this well, is there's a guy named Jim Carls down there who used to be the chief forester for the state of Florida, and burning is such part of the culture there. And if you're in California and you need to do a prescribed fire, you're going to go through 9 different agencies to get 9 different permits, and it's going to take you 9 months, and the burn windows are really short. And in the South, they've managed to figure out how the federal government, the state government, local government can get on the same page, anoint Jim Carls as the state forester to issue the permit. And Jim Carls tells me I can issue a burn permit in 4 minutes on behalf of all the agencies. So there's some cool things that we can do, some lessons. Not everything's great in the South. I'm from the South, son of the South. I love the South, but that's a good idea. And then the last bit of good news I would say is to me, I see a growing sense of bipartisanship on this. America is so polarized along political lines, but forest restoration is something where I just see more and more Republicans and Democrats coming there, where you're a Republican who has wildfire in Wyoming, or a Democrat's got wildfire in California. There is this growing consensus that we need to. This is one area where we can work together, and kind of in the economist world, we call that the Overton's window, where it's these seemingly impossible policy things will never get solved, but you get this little window that opens, and you can drive that little car through there and solve the problem. And I see that Overton window opening here when it comes to forest policy management. The last thing I would say is just the role of partnerships here and how important that is, and that gives me hope. I know the Forest Service, you guys have tapped National Wild Turkey Federation, Pheasants Forever, to do some of the work that needs to be done on the ground, and pulling in other conservation organizations. Good Neighbor Authority is a policy that pulls in states and tribes and local governments to do some of the forest management too, and to help pitch in. And speaking of partnerships, I mean, the fact that we're sitting up here, that PERC is a partner of the Forest Service in this work, and a partner with Tall Timbers, working on ways to improve the culture of prescribed fire, partners with Randy on these things, gives me hope.
Well, it gives me hope talking to all of you amazing folks, and it gives me hope that all of you come to learn more about this so that you can go out and advocate. Just thank you all so much. Thanks to everybody here. Really enjoy it. We'll see you at the reception. Hey, it's Ed again. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast. I know your time is valuable, so it means the world that you spend it listening. If you want to support the podcast and help it to continue to spread and grow, there are a few ways you can help. Number 1, pass it along to a friend or share it on social media. Word of mouth recommendations are the most powerful way for ideas to spread, so I'd love it if you could share the podcast with a few pals who might enjoy it. Number 2, you can go to Apple Podcasts and give it a 5-star review. Good reviews encourage the Apple overlords to suggest the podcast to others. So there's a link in the notes if you'd be so kind as to give it 5 stars. Number 3, you can support the podcast financially via Patreon. and there are exclusive benefits for those who do, including a monthly behind-the-scenes newsletter, Mountain and Prairie stickers, live and recorded video chats with podcast guests, and much more. Number 4, I've also got 2 emails that I send out. The first is my weekly email called Good News from the American West, which I send out every Wednesday. It's only positive news, something we can all use a little more of these days. And my other email is my bi-monthly book recommendations email. One email every other month with 5, 6, 7, or 8 books that I've recently read and highly recommend. The thousands of people on both of these lists will vouch for me. No spam or other funny business. And number 5, finally, check out my online store for Mountain and Prairie stickers, shirts, and coffee mugs. I've got some really cool designs from Western artists with more on the way. So head to mountainandprairie.com/shop to check it all out. I'd love to connect with you. I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn, so look me up on either of those platforms by my name or through the links on my website. All right, that's it. Thanks so much for your support.